How's it going, guys? It's Zimzilla, and on Godzilla Unscripted, we're going to talk about his origins, why there's less of them than you think, but why they ultimately matter. Now, if you aren't, I would love for you to subscribe to the channel. Over 50% of you aren't, and it would mean the world to me if you did. I want to see if I can maybe get to over 2,000 subscribers by the start of June, so let's make it happen. And if you're being ultra generous, I would love for you to become a patron here. For all patrons at any tier, your name will be read out loud at the end of each video, and for higher tiers, you'll have early access to videos and other projects I'm working on, and at the highest tiers, suggest videos that help me decide the future and direction of this channel. So let's get into the origin, shall we? The first origin, which is shared with the Godzilla from Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, is that it was a previously unknown prehistoric sea creature that was mutated by the hydrogen bombs. As a result, this Godzilla shares its origins with another Godzilla, but also several more, but we'll get into that. Now, the second unique origin is that of the Heisei Godzilla, where instead of being an unknown prehistoric sea creature, is instead a dinosaur, a Godzillasaurus, that was mutated due to a Soviet nuclear sub crashing near its vicinity, and as a result mutating it into a new Godzilla. Now, the third unique origin is that of the 98 Godzilla, where instead of being a dinosaur or some kind of prehistoric creature, is instead a modern-day iguana that was mutated by French Polynesia nuclear test. The next unique origin is that of GMK Godzilla. In this case, we don't know whether it's the resurrected first Godzilla or wholly new Godzilla, but regardless, this new Godzilla was manifested by the restless souls of those who died to the Imperial Japanese military to take revenge on the Japanese people. Following it, the next unique origin is that of the Monsterverse. Now, the continuity of the Monsterverse and the lore behind it can be a little wonky, but we can assume that much of it has remained intact. In this case, from the first film, we know that Godzilla is an ancient species that is able to feed on radiation, so instead of becoming mutated and then having a relationship to radiation, this Godzilla was already having an association with radiation. And as a result, Godzilla and his species, whether those are still canon or not, were able to feed on this radiation during the late Permian era, where his species supposedly evolved. However, as the climate changed and mass extinctions occurred, the radiation levels went down, this Godzilla and other creatures like it, who fed on radiation, would go further into the ground. However, we also know of the Hollow Earth, and we don't know whether Godzilla species came from the Hollow Earth and moved up to the surface and then went down as the radiation subsided. Regardless, what is important about the Monsterverse's origins is the fact that Godzilla was already associated with nuclear energy. Now, Shin is very similar to that of Minus and 54. In this case, Shin is an undersea prehistoric sea creature that was instead not mutated by a bomb, but fed off nuclear waste. Similar to how the Heisei design and that continuity had its Godzilla change, where a nuclear sub crashed in the nuclear waste or the nuclear energy is what mutated the Heisei Godzilla, Shin, by feeding off of the nuclear energy, was able to become a new Godzilla. Now, Minus, similar to Heisei and 54, is a dinosaur, like Heisei, that is mutated by the Castle Bravo test like 54. As a result, Shin and Minus both have similar origins, although Minus is a little bit more faithful. Now on to the two extremely unique origins for Godzilla. Both of them, ironically enough, coming from anime. Starting with the anime trilogy, Godzilla Earth, instead of being an animal, evolved from plant life. Now, after 20,000 years, it became the dominant life form on the planet and was able to terraform it entirely to suit its own ends, as a result, creating a planet Godzilla, essentially. Now, Singular Point is extremely drastic in the fact that, although ultimately resembling Godzilla, this Godzilla and the other kaiju are essentially just pieces of an eldritch abomination that is able to see time and space in its own unique way, essentially being able to see all these things at once. And as a result, all these creatures are only small aspects of this all-encompassing being rather than unique creatures itself. And due to its nature, it has no direct relationship to mankind. Rather, is examining what humanity is doing, and ultimately it choosing to allow itself to be defeated is what saves the day in Godzilla's Singular Point. Now, looking at all of these origins, there's a lot of similarities. In most cases, Godzilla is the product of mankind's hubris. The only one that really isn't is Singular Point, and to a lesser extent Earth, but we'll get into that because his characterization is also tied to his origins, but there's some differences to consider. Now, you're probably wondering, there's a bunch of movies I missed, those being really all the Showa series and a lot of the Millennium films, and that is because a lot of those films, in this case the Showa series especially, is a direct sequel to 54, and in this case, we do know from external material where other members of Godzilla's species that could have been mutated or just directly killed, but if we're allowing the idea that there are second Godzillas that appeared, it is more than likely, without direct confirmation, that their origins are the same, if not exactly the same, as the first Godzilla. So that would include Godzilla 2000 from Godzilla 2000 the movie, the Kiryu Godzilla, as well as Godzilla Final Wars. And now, since we only follow one Godzilla throughout the entire Showa continuity, that means the vast majority of Godzilla's origins are the same as the 54 Godzilla, and as a result, it should usually be the definitive origin. Now, Minus and Shin are good deviations from this because although they drastically change a few things in Shin's case, and in Minus' case, take some aspects of the Heisei Godzilla's origins, they still do the job of making Godzilla directly related to mankind in some way, shape, or form. Now, the problem with Earth is that although this plant that ultimately becomes Godzilla is responding to human industrialism and its mistakes, it is not a direct result of it. It is far more nebulous, which does tie into Godzilla being the sort of godlike creature, but the problem with that is that it doesn't give a direct tie or central idea to his character. In this case, it makes all of humanity responsible rather than just a specific idea, event, or concept. Whereas even looking at the other monsters within the anime trilogy, where you have Mechagodzilla, the result of Billis-Saluto technology and Ghidorah's nihilism, Godzilla is sort of a weird byproduct, as at this point humanity had already been fighting hundreds of monsters beforehand. Godzilla just becomes a cherry on top, and his presence as the ultimate life form really only works because, well, it's Godzilla, so we have to make a Godzilla. But what I don't have a problem with in this origin is the fact that Godzilla is this all-encompassing force, and the same goes for the Singular Point too. Every single case, with the exception of Shin to a small degree, and 98 especially, Godzilla's origins create a extremely powerful monster that is able to contend with humanity, and as a result, it is through humanity's actions we need to, when making these films, if Godzilla is shown to be immune to almost anything that humanity can throw against him, and requires extreme ingenuity, or advanced weapons that we can't make in the real world, that is what makes Godzilla's origins impactful, but also brings a lot of thematic depth to it. In the case of Godzilla 84, because Godzilla is in an era where the Cold War is very impactful, we see that it is Soviet nuclear energy that causes Godzilla to become mutated, and then later on, Japanese nuclear energy in the case of the nuclear sub that was hidden. And obviously the espionage can tie into 84's first mutation, but it is the secrecy as well of the Japanese, in this case Shindo, that causes Godzilla to become even more powerful. And as a result, these mistakes culminating in what makes an even more powerful Godzilla. And that's why, for more or less, even though Godzilla is a plant in the anime trilogy and his whole idea is becoming this guardian of nature, and really this is the only true force of nature Godzilla, as since it is not the direct result of any specific human action, it is truly a new force of nature that is being created. And ultimately, at the end of it all, what really matters is that Godzilla's silhouette remains intact throughout his origins, and that's where 98 kind of falls flat. Although the idea of a modern day creature becoming Godzilla could possibly work, the fact is that 98 doesn't work because Godzilla is no longer really man's mistake in the sense of it could actually cause mass destruction through its own malicious actions. 98 is literally just a giant animal, and if the film actually presented the humans as competent as they should be, 98 would have been dead almost instantly. And as a result, the impact that is the origin and the genesis of Godzilla loses a lot of its flair there, where in most cases Godzilla is a product of war, where in this case it is kind of a product of war with 98 but not really, and as a result it spawns something that ultimately isn't actually a threat. And a lot of the time the film does everything it can to make Godzilla not a threat at all and human action more destructive, but not in a way that's thematically relevant, but instead essentially, oh, look at these dumb humans and doing things that can't beat Godzilla because Godzilla is so cool, but that all falls flat. And moving back to Singular Point, this is when you get a really divorced origin for Godzilla. And in this case, Godzilla is not even really Godzilla. It's an entity that is creating a Godzilla. And as a result, what does this really mean for humanity in this case? Because they didn't create it, they didn't cause it. This is an external threat that is coming to fight against humanity. But even still, I think that the origins works because when looking at this Godzilla, it is still humanity's ingenuity and desire to live, which is key to Godzilla Minus One's story. That is what ultimately allows this entity to essentially be like, okay, cool, and then dips out, because even though the human characters are able to solve the story throughout Singular Point, it is ultimately really from external material, that entity itself deciding that it's just gonna go out on its own terms. Now, not having a direct relation to humans is another problem with other Godzilla origins, especially the newer ones, because in this case, the Monsterverse has no real connection to humanity either. Godzilla is a naturally evolving creature, and his power, his nuclear power, is a byproduct of nature itself. The actions that humanity does are minimal, really, in the grand scheme of Godzilla's, origins and his life, because when you think about it, if humans never evolved, Godzilla would still be Godzilla. Godzilla would be doing all his Godzilla things. Godzilla's actions often have weight because had humanity not taken the actions it did, Godzilla wouldn't have appeared. But in the Monsterverse, due to the fact that Godzilla is so old and his powers are directly tied to himself rather than humanity, there's less of that connection there, even though Godzilla is supposed to be this defender of humanity and nature, and that whole idea gets muddled often, and it makes you wonder, why do that? And I think a lot of people, especially earlier on, took issue with that in Godzilla 2014, where we already see a giant Godzilla just being hit by a nuclear bomb rather than that being what gives him his abilities. And it makes a whole lot of sense why people would take issue with that, because obviously being an American film and the fact that America dropped the bombs on Japan, it may come off as insensitive, and I don't think that that was necessarily the case, because the film does try to discuss these ideas and consider that humans' arrogance is what causes these problems to occur. But when you divorce Godzilla from that arrogance, it does make him feel like a divorced party, especially from 2014, which is one big problem with that film. Now, GMK is another film that takes Godzilla in a different direction, where instead of being this prehistoric creature, he's come from the restless souls, resurrecting Godzilla or creating a new one. But the reason why it works is that we already have a Godzilla in this universe with that distinct origin and that important origin, being that he is the result of mankind's mistakes and tied to the Japanese people. But it is able to then reinforce this new Godzilla's origins, where humanity not done the actions that it did with the bombs, and had Japan not attacked America and done the actions it did, this new Godzilla wouldn't have appeared, and as a result, Godzilla directly impacts the actions of the people in the film, and why he's so thematically rich in that sense. Earth, again, similarly, because Godzilla the Plants is evolving alongside humanity rather than a direct result of a specific human action, he becomes far more nebulous, and the theming is more overarching rather than deeply rich because of its specific origins. Singular Point, like I said, is similar, but in those cases, especially Earth and 98 as well, the problem is, if the origin is so divorced, why use Godzilla? Because ultimately, Godzilla should be a prehistoric creature or a dinosaur of some kind becoming mutated, because that is what he is. He is and always was intended to be a prehistoric dinosaur of some kind. So looking first at 98's case, the only reason why Godzilla 98 looks the way he does is because they wanted to make a monster design that was more influenced by modern interpretations of dinosaurs, rather than trying to take a actual dinosaur or like a mutated prehistoric creature already and then turning it into that new Godzilla design, because you have to essentially justify the idea that a lizard changes itself so entirely from the radiation that it becomes a wholly unrecognizable creature. Whereas in Godzilla's case, the whole point of his origins wasn't that he looked so different and then becomes this wholly different creature. Then there's like no relation. You can never guess that Godzilla was this before he became what he is. Minus One and the Heisei series do this well, where because we actually see the pre-mutated forms of Godzilla, we're able to understand that yes, Godzilla did look different, but it is through the actions of humanity that he becomes so different, so changed, and as a result, that thematic relationship that Godzilla has with humanity and Godzilla's anger at humanity makes sense. And as a result, I think that when you are making Godzilla's origins, and therefore also this ties into Godzilla's design, you need to make sure that Godzilla is tied to the distant past, because it is something that we had no idea was around, becoming roused, becoming changed, and becoming this whole new problem because of our arrogance and our mistakes. There is that man versus nature aspect to Godzilla, but it is that fine line that you're walking and those unique aspects that make Godzilla so special. And by tweaking it, you do lose some of those. It's sort of like pulling on a thread, and when you pull more of that thread out, everything just becomes undone. And I think that is why it really is, Godzilla has a pretty distinct origin, because if Godzilla 55 is the same origin as Godzilla 54 in the sense that it was another one of the Godzilla pre-mutated species that was also mutated by the same bomb, that means that Godzilla has had the same origin from 54 all the way to 75. Although 84 has a different origin, it is still very similar. That also makes sense, But then if you go into the Millennium series, Godzilla 2000, same origin as 55, which means it has the same origins as 54. Megaguirus definitely has the same origins because it's supposed to be the 1954 Godzilla. Same goes for Final Wars. Same especially goes for the Kiryu series, because in both those films, it is a second Godzilla and is directly following up the original Godzilla, so you can more than likely believe that its origin is the same as the second Godzilla from any other continuity, which just leaves the odd ones out. And the odd ones out are often done better because they're directly tied to those original unique origins. GMK, sequel to 54, as a result, it's able to persist in a pretty unique, special way, despite being so divorced. Earth suffers from this. Shin, not as much, because although it is very different, it is still feeding on a mistake, and in this case less war, but still a problem and this arrogance that humanity had, so a lot more tweaking, but still can kind of work. 98, although mutated from war, the culprits have really nothing to do with where it attacks, so at least in 54's case, although it is the American bombs that mutate Godzilla being thematically tied to the fear of nuclear devastation, attacks Japan. In this case, it is a third country, France, that mutates Godzilla, and then Godzilla decides to attack America. Instead of what could have been thematically interesting is that a nuclear test from America, even like in the distant past, is what mutates this Godzilla. Now Godzilla is directly attacking the people that mutated it, which could have been something interesting, but we don't get that. And as a result, the film has to justify its plot in a way where you divorce a lot of parties from wrongdoing, which shouldn't be justified in any way, shape, or form, in the French Secret Service especially. And Singular Point, again, very divorced, and I think that it is one of probably the most divorced, but due to its role in the story, it's not just an animal, and it's not easily taken care of. It is a creature that wants to destroy everything in existence, but can also just passively observe. It does tie into Godzilla's characterization, but not in a way that allows him to be so divorced from himself that it feels out of place. And like any film, you're taking all these parts together, and same thing for a TV series, to create a whole, and that is always a big challenge when it comes to adapting and making new a character that's been around for so long. But I hope this helps people understand that Godzilla has a pretty consistent origin, and that origin should be respected, because that ultimately justifies his relation to humanity as well as justifies his design. And I think that's all for now, guys. Subscribe if you haven't, like, comment your thoughts below. I love interacting with you guys, and I'm Simzilla, and I'll see you guys next time.